11 things from 1970s California kids today wouldn't believe. There was a California that existed before the apps, before the anxiety, before every sidewalk became a screen. A California where kids vanished into the neighborhood after breakfast and nobody panicked, where the smell of the Pacific mixed with sunscreen and eucalyptus, and the whole long golden afternoon was yours to fill. If you were a kid in 1970s California, you already know exactly what I'm about to describe. And if you weren't, what you're about to hear might be the most foreign thing you've ever encountered. Because some of this, a lot of this, is simply gone. Here are 11 things from 1970s California childhood that kids today would not believe were real. The complete and total freedom of an unsupervised summer. There was no itinerary, no camp schedule, no supervised enrichment program, no parent tracking location on a phone. In 1970s California, summer for a kid meant this. The front door opened in the morning and you didn't come back until the streetlights flickered on. Nobody knew exactly where you were. That was normal. That was the point. You built things from nothing in vacant lots. You crossed 4 lanes of traffic on your bike to get to the creek. You knocked on doors and assembled a group of 8 kids with nothing but a ball and an afternoon. There were no waivers, no helmets mandated by ordinance, no adult facilitating the activity. What was being built, invisibly, without anyone realizing, was something kids today rarely get to grow: the ability to solve problems nobody prepared you for. The scraped knees were the lesson. The argument over the rules of the game was the lesson. The long ride home alone in the golden late afternoon, knowing you had to be back before the lights came on, that was the lesson. And California in the 1970s gave kids a classroom that was 3,000 miles wide and entirely, beautifully unsupervised. Thrifty ice cream and the cylindrical scoop. If you grew up in California in the 70s, there is a specific memory somewhere in your body, not just your mind, of a particular kind of ice cream. It was from Thrifty Drugstore. It cost a nickel a scoop. A double cone was a dime. And the scoop itself was unlike anything in the world, a cylindrical metal press that produced a perfect flat-topped column of ice cream, not a rounded ball, just a little piece of California engineering. Chocolate malted crunch, Rocky Road, tropical punch sherbet so bright it looked engineered by a cartoon studio. You'd stand at that low counter. It was always at the very front of the store, right by the entrance, as if Thrifty wanted you to smell it before you'd even decided to come in. And you'd watch the woman behind the counter press that cylindrical scooper into the tub like she was doing something ceremonial. Kids today have artisan ice cream. They have nitrogen-frozen custom flavors. They have aesthetic food built for photographs. But they don't have a nickel. And they don't have that counter, and they don't have the feeling of walking out onto a California sidewalk in summer, cone in hand, with nowhere to be and the whole long afternoon still in front of them.
The backyard pool as a skate park. In the mid-1970s, California experienced one of the worst droughts in its recorded history. Families across the state drained their backyard swimming pools to conserve water. The concrete bowls sat empty in the heat, and a group of teenage surfers from a gritty stretch of coastline between Santa Monica and Venice, a place the locals called Dogtown, looked at those empty curves of concrete and saw something nobody else did. They saw waves. The Z-Boys, the Zephyr skateboard team, dropped into those empty pools and, in doing so, invented aerial skateboarding. They took their low, crouching, surf-influenced style into the bowls and started riding the walls, coming up over the lip, going vertical. Kids would call the shop and say, "Hey, we found a pool." That was the entire underground network, a phone call, a skateboard, a drained pool in Brentwood or Bel Air, abandoned after a wildfire, sitting empty and perfect in the California sun. Every skate park on Earth today, every halfpipe, every bowl, every competition you've ever watched traces its lineage directly back to those kids, that drought, and those empty California swimming pools. The architecture of an entire global sport was built invisibly in someone's backyard because it hadn't rained. Drive-in movie theaters. At the peak of drive-in popularity, the Los Angeles metropolitan area alone was home to nearly 70 drive-in theaters. 70! As a kid in 1970s California, this was just where movies lived. You loaded into the back of the station wagon in your pajamas. Sometimes someone brought a pillow. The speaker, a tinny metal box that hooked over the half-rolled window, crackled with the movie's sound, while the enormous white screen filled your entire field of vision. There was a playground under the screen. You could run around before the feature started while your parents unloaded the cooler. There was a concession stand that sold things called nachos, long before most of America knew the word. For the kids in the back seat, the drive-in was magic. For the parents up front, it was one of the last places in American life where the whole family could be together, willingly, quietly, under an open sky. Nobody had to agree on the channel. Nobody had to be somewhere at a specific time. You just pointed the car at the screen, and the California night did the rest. Saturday morning cartoons as a sacred ritual. Saturday began before the sun had fully committed to the day. You were up by 6, possibly 5:30, not because you had to be, because the window was closing. The cartoons only ran on Saturday morning, and then they were gone for an entire week. You could not rewind, you could not stream, you could not pause. You made a bowl of cereal with the kind of sugar content that would require a government warning today. You sat cross-legged on the carpet approximately 18 inches from the television set, and for 4 straight hours, the television belonged entirely to you. Scooby-Doo, Super Friends, Hong Kong Phooey, Schoolhouse Rock squeezed between the shows, teaching you grammar and American history through earworms you'd hum for the rest of your life. Parents slept. The house was yours. What that ritual was actually building, invisibly, every Saturday, was a very specific experience of anticipation, of waiting for something good, of knowing that scarcity made the thing precious. Kids today can watch anything, anytime, from anywhere. Nothing runs out, nothing disappears, and something got lost in that.
Roller rinks as the social internet. Before social media, before texting, before the group chat, California kids had the roller rink. On Friday nights, the rinks were packed. The Flippers roller disco on La Cienega in Los Angeles, Cal Skate in Rohnert Park, Star Skate World in Santa Rosa. These were not just places to skate. They were the entire social infrastructure of adolescence. You skated in circles for hours, and everything that mattered, who liked who, what the weekend plan was, what was happening at school Monday, got worked out in those laps. The lights were low. The disco ball threw spinning light across the rink like a private galaxy. The music from the loudspeakers was physical. You could feel it in your chest. And the couples skate, that slowed-down 2-song window where the overhead lights dimmed even further, was the most emotionally high-stakes event in a 10-year-old social calendar. The California roller rink was the algorithm before algorithms. It was the feed. It was where you were seen and where you saw, where the social order of childhood got negotiated and renegotiated every single Friday night. In person, in motion, in the dark. The Helms Bakery Truck. There was a sound that Southern California kids of the 1970s heard and immediately began moving toward. Not an ice cream truck jingle, something older, a wooden whistle, 2 notes, rising, the second note hanging just long enough to say, "I am here, come find me." The Helms Bakery Truck. A long yellow truck that rolled through the neighborhoods, driven by a man who knew every street by name. He'd pull open the back and those long wooden drawers would slide out, compartment after compartment of fresh bread, donuts, pastries, rolls. The smell that came out of those drawers was the smell of something made this morning, nearby, by actual hands. Mom would come to the door, or she'd send you with exact change. You'd stand there while the driver pulled out what you needed and wrapped it in paper. No app, no 30-minute window, just a man who knew your neighborhood and came back every week, regular as the tides, because that was his route and you were on it. The Helms truck stopped running in 1969, but its memory lasted so deep into the 70s that California kids grew up in the afterglow of it, hearing parents speak about it, seeing the old familiar yellow trucks converted to other uses, still carrying the name. A whole way of being in a neighborhood delivered to your door. Swap meets at the old drive-in lots. When the drive-ins began to close, and they did begin to close one by one through the late 70s, something interesting happened to the land they left behind. The big flat lots with their speaker poles still jutting from the asphalt like little metal trees became swap meets. The Rhodium in Torrance, the Paramount Drive-In lot, dozens of others across the state, their giant screens gone, their projection booths quiet, now filling on weekend mornings with tables and canopies and the slow, wonderful chaos of people selling everything they had ever owned. As a kid, the swap meet was a sensory experience that had no equivalent. The smell of tamales from a folding table, old records in milk crates, real vinyl, the kind you had to handle carefully, toys, tools, 8-track tapes, clothes from 3 eras mixed together without apology. You went in with $3 and you never knew what you'd come home with. A paperback, a Hot Wheels car still in the package, a CB radio that didn't quite work. The swap meet was the original algorithm-free marketplace. Nobody had curated your feed. Nobody knew what you were likely to buy. You just walked the rows and let the world surprise you. And it always did.
The transistor radio and music that came from the air. There was a small object, roughly the size of a deck of cards, that California kids in the 1970s treated like a portal. The transistor radio. You could put it in your pocket. You could carry it to the beach, to the park, to the back of the lot where you were building something out of scrap wood and nobody could see you. The antenna pulled from the top and you pointed it at the sky and the music came in. KHJ in Los Angeles, KFRC in San Francisco, KFWB, K-Earth 101. California had radio stations that treated the airwaves like their own personal kingdom, and if you were a kid with a transistor radio, you were tapped into the same signal as every other kid in the state. There was something happening in that shared experience that is genuinely hard to explain now. The DJ chose the song. You didn't. You waited to hear what came next. Sometimes you heard a song for the first time, and you never forgot where you were standing when it hit you. Music was something that arrived. It came through the air, uninvited and unscheduled, and you either caught it or you missed it. There was no playlist. There was no algorithm serving you songs it thought you'd like. There was just the air and whatever was riding it. The public library as a world without walls. Before Google, before Wikipedia, before anything, if you wanted to know something, really know it, the way knowledge felt when it had weight, you went to the library.
California's public libraries in the 1970s were genuinely different places than they are today. Not worse, different. The card catalog was a wall of small wooden drawers, each one stuffed with index cards typed on actual typewriters, and finding what you needed in there was its own kind of skill. Kids in California grew up spending whole afternoons in those buildings, not because anyone made them, because the library was air-conditioned on hot days. It was quiet in a way that home rarely was, and somewhere inside it was an answer to every question you'd ever thought of. Encyclopedias that smelled like paper and time, the Prelinger footage made public, old issues of Life magazine in bound volumes, the photographs of the 1940s and 1950s teaching you that the world had been different before you arrived. You checked out the books with a card, a real card, your name handwritten on it, and a librarian stamped the due date in the back with a rubber stamp that made a satisfying thwack. The information was there, but you had to want it. You had to go to it. That friction wasn't a flaw. That friction was the feature. The feeling that California itself was still being invented. This last one is harder to name than the others, but it may be the one that mattered most. In 1970s California, there was a feeling, specific to that place, specific to that time, that the state itself was still in motion, that the story wasn't finished, that the rules hadn't all been written yet. The suburbs were genuinely new. Entire neighborhoods had been orange groves a decade before. The freeways were still being extended. The valleys were filling in with houses faster than maps could keep up. And the kids growing up inside all of that, this expanding, sun-soaked, still in construction version of the American dream, there was a texture to daily life that is almost impossible to recreate. The air smelled different, not just cleaner, though it was often cleaner at the coast. It smelled like something being built, like possibility that hadn't curdled yet into expectation. The parents who'd come to California had come believing in something, and their kids grew up breathing that belief in, without fully knowing what it was. It shaped them, invisibly, the way the best things do. 11 pieces of a world that raised a generation, quietly, slowly, without asking for credit. The empty afternoon and the nickel cone, the skater in the drained pool discovering something nobody had a name for yet, the transistor radio in your pocket pulling music out of thin air. These weren't just activities, they were architecture, the invisible kind, the kind that gets built into you before you're old enough to see what's being constructed. The kids who grew up in 1970s California didn't know they were living inside something rare, they just lived in it. And maybe that's the most remarkable thing of all. If you grew up in California back then, or anywhere in America in that era, tell us in the comments which one of these hit you the hardest, and what would you add to this list that we didn't. We want to hear your version of it, your street, your rink, your drive-in, your town.